Cannabis Business Minds, we train and mentor professionals, entrepreneurs, and aspiring entrepreneurs on how to confidently find their place in the legal cannabis and hemp industries. Come on and join us at cannabisbusinessminds.com. On our next episode with Paula, we are going to talk about what it really is that cannabis entrepreneurs should be thinking about when it comes to taxes. The fastest way you can get into trouble with taxes as an entrepreneur, which is really important to understand. And then also we're going to talk about bankruptcy and debt in the cannabis industry. This is something that a lot of people actually just feel really uncomfortable talking about. And this is something that Paula actually understands. So we're going to get her insight on cannabis and bankruptcy.
My only question is about taxes. There's also a cannabis tax that's imposed on the retailer, right?
Which is very interesting because I have a client who's a card winner.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing that the state has, none of the information reminds them to go back to that portal and register for their for their cannabis taxes.
Well, I'm actually very concerned about just like who is like that go-to person when it comes to state cannabis tax at like the state level, because like my whole thing is like, as a CPA, I don't do taxes. I was an auditor, but I do much more financial coaching and programs now. But I always do the analysis, but what's the burden going to be? And when I was looking at just the tax levied on the manufacturers, or kind of within the supply chain, some of the tax, if you're selling a high milligram of THC and it's an edible because it's taxed differently, will give somebody a negative gross profit just along the lines of selling that product. And so like as accountants, we understand like, okay, well, if you're selling a product at a negative gross profit, it's cost you more to actually produce that product than you can even sell it for. You haven't even accounted for 280E. You haven't even accounted for sales, your overhead, your sales costs, all of that. And so I tried to make like a stink about it. And I literally got nowhere with the state. And I was like, wait, but if the point is to set up businesses for success, and there's a glaring issue here already, what the heck is happening? And so I'm curious, like what are the conversations just around the taxes? Because it seems like they've already kind of, and I feel like this is kind of like poo-pooing on the government a bit, but they've kind of dropped the ball when it comes to some of this stuff as the registration process, the license process. But I think a bigger ball that happened in Washington, happened in California, that they had to kind of rethink taxes. And that put a lot of businesses out of business before the government actually decided to rethink how the whole tax structure worked. What's happening right now in New York?
What's happening right now in New York is that you have a number of regulators who either don't know the plant at all. They've heard that there's this way that states can raise money. It's that same old perception that we hear even from entrepreneurs, which is, oh, I'm going to get this marijuana business and I'm going to be a millionaire. Well, let's back up. Let's see how you're going to get to that $1 million mark. Yeah. And if I can get you there, we'll both feel good about that, right?
Yes.
So there's that. So you have regulators who don't really understand the plant. They don't understand the science of the plant. So they don't understand that taxing by milligram is going to make that product out of reach for the business owner and then out of reach for the consumer. So then what does that do? The consumer is going to go to the gray market.
Yeah.
The other thing is you have multiple committees. Last night I was up late because I was reviewing a proposed amendment, which is designed as an enforcement piece. And first of all, it quotes some, each paragraph of the amendment is to be inserted into a different portion of the New York tax law. But it's all like I wish I had it handy. I don't have it right in front of me, but the punitive measure seems to be if you are breaking the law with regard to unlicensed sales, you will then have your certificate of registration revoked. Now that certificate of registration is the registration on the cannabis tax portal. So
what? That's so silly.
Well, and so did you really think about that? Like, did you really walk through, if somebody has this smoke shop, they haven't registered with the cannabis tax portal.
Yeah.
Because as I say, many of the smoke shops aren't selling weed, they're selling memberships, or they're selling stickers, or there's, I've got some sophisticated shops where they're selling novelty ideas or artwork or, high-end vintage clothing. And congratulations, here's your beautiful shirt and here's your weed.
Wow. But I just remember it's a principle that I learned, substance over form. Like really okay, the form is you're selling a t-shirt and you're getting money, but you're really selling a t-shirt and you're giving this cannabis. And ultimately, like when you think about it from like an audit perspective, whoever does enforce that at the very end of the day, and maybe they won't because they're going to be so overwhelmed with everything else, but wouldn't they go back and say, but you did sell that vintage amazing t-shirt and for whatever, $30, and you also gave a gram away, but the value of looking at those two was 30. I mean, where do you see this going at the end of the day? Do you think that these businesses will be able to actually skirt around this legally, or is it something that with the right eye and looking at substance over form, it won't pass the sniff test?
Well, and the question is, who's going to be sniffing?
Yeah, right. I think that's the big one.
Does the government have the bandwidth to go through that audit, which, as you well know, could go on for 12 to 18 months.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, because it's a process, that shop is going to continue in business because they're not guilty of anything yet. They're undergoing an audit. So they're going to continue in business. Meanwhile, the quote unquote licensed shops that have done the right thing and participated in the state framework will be struggling. So again, the way to support the licensed market is to get more people in the licensed market, and that will also equalize prices.
Yes.
Because of course, a pre-roll in an unlicensed shop can sell for, the terrible weed is selling for $10 a pre-roll. The better weed, you could spend $40 to $50 on a pre-roll. That's supposedly very good quality.
Wow.
You go over to the licensed shop, singular, and the price framework is much different. Now, in truth, there are some comparable pricing structures. They're not so off. But remember, we opened that one licensed shop December 30th of 2022. The harvest was way back in October. So that product kind of sat, and then that's that one shop. New York State issued, if you had a hemp cultivating license, you could log in and get your conditional cannabis cultivating license. At the behest of the state, many people did this. At the behest of the state, many farmers put seeds in the ground, incurred the expense of that harvest, have product now in plastic storage bins. What's going to be the quality of that product by the time it hits the shelves? Much of it was, sold for oils or sold to manufacturers for various purposes. But again, the farmers were left holding the bag because that would have been sold at a discount, far less.
My goodness.
Yeah.
And how many licensed? So we were kind of just talking about, okay, so there's like one licensed retailer, but from along, like if we go down the supply chain, how does the licensing look from, not, if you don't know specifics, it's fine, but just like even percentages or ranges of cultivators and manufacturers?
I don't have those numbers in front of me. I need to do that research. I was at a meeting recently where I believe that the number was 2,800 conditional processors, and of that 2,800, there was not a single person of color.
Wow. Wow. But I thought, and it's interesting actually not knowing a market so well, like me in New York. I thought the first set of licenses all around would go to social equity.
Well, that was the thought, but because they did the same thing with the processing and manufacturing license, where if you were already processing hemp, you could log in and with very little effort and very low fee, get your cannabis processing license. So that's where it went. And it was, you kind of, pardon me, when the state was doing this, you kind of believed what they were doing because they were like, no, we need people up and going because we're going to open these shops. The anticipation was the shops were going to open in September of 2022.
Wow. Okay. So best case, so you kind of painted some solutions about like, how do we actually stop what's like the illegal activity from the retail perspective? But okay, seems like there's a lot of moving parts that weren't necessarily predicted that maybe aren't the most beneficial to the people that were really excited about this. And, that might have even passed the law. Although I'm sure most Americans are very much in favor of cannabis legalization, but so it's not necessarily going to plan. So what's the best case scenario that you believe can happen in the next 12 months?
In the next 12 months, I believe that with this transitional license that I proposed, we will again support the licensed market by bringing more people into that licensed market and therefore stabilize and equalize the shops. We will also clean up some of the nefarious players, some of the people who are unwilling to work with the communities. Pardon me. We will also raise awareness like, okay, why was that shop there? It sprang up, it did business, it had its garish kind of bongs and signage, and now it's gone. What happened? And so the consumer, that will increase consumer awareness about what is the value of a regulated market. Pardon me.
Do you think from a numbers perspective in 12 months, from a retailer perspective, do you anticipate that it could be more than the 35 that you said earlier? Or do you think that's actually realistic?
I think so. I think that, we have what we didn't get into is the nonprofit requirement that the state imposed.
Will tell us about that though, too.
Okay. So, and I'm part of, I've co-founded an organization called the New York Consortium of Cannabis Accountants. My co-founder and I will actually be doing my co-founder is Allison Kirschhofer. We will be doing a webinar or a seminar in a few weeks for our membership on this use of the term nonprofit, because if you say nonprofit to somebody from the West Coast, alarms go off because of course they used that to skirt the law or to skirt 280E. New York, on the other hand, when they proposed the conditional adult use retail dispensary license, one of the ways that somebody could get that license was if they had a nonprofit that was in existence already, not that they formed a nonprofit, but they already had one that was serving the community disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. They could, as an organization, apply for this conditional retail dispensary license. Well, alarms went off, and I couldn't really articulate it until I spoke with another accountant who's from the West Coast, who said, wait a second, that's going to potentially negate their status as a nonprofit with the IRS. And we won't know that really until the end of that business cycle. And until that until the business files their return and has to report this activity, which, okay, so in the case of the one dispensary that's open, it's Housing Works, which is an organization dedicated to AIDS prevention, AIDS education, supporting AIDS patients. They were vital in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
They operate, and they still have those education and support programs. They now operate a number of resale shops, consignment shops throughout the city. So in New York, if you say, I'm going to clean my closet and take everything to Housing Works, that is a very commonly spoken, it's just ubiquitous. So then Housing Works contracted with an organization to open this retail dispensary for them, thinking that the money from that will then support their basic mission, which is AIDS education and support. You kind of get there until you realize, but wait, the IRS is going to view your cannabis dispensary differently than it views your resale shops, right?
Exactly. And then you're like,
it's not Schedule 1 substance.
Exactly. And then you all of a sudden are trafficking Schedule 1. So then it's 280E. Unless, I mean, how does it work? I mean, I've never seen this. I've worked for a few not-for-profits, but like would you have another legal entity? You can't, because that one legal entity is the not-for-profit that's registered with the IRS. So it's not like they could have even gotten around it by creating a separate legal entity.
So, and interesting that you mentioned 280E, because I attended the community board meeting at which this organization presented, and I must say that the public was very in favor of this, you know, because there is such a fuzzy feeling about housing works, because that's how we clean our closets, right? And so, and it was also, you're accustomed to operating retail shops, and so it's not such a stretch for you to operate this. But the CEO said, yes, and we think that we will ultimately be able to offer cannabis products to the consumer for less money than other shops, because we will be able to work around 280E. And I'm like, no,
you won't. No, you won't.
Please stop now.
Oh my God.
No, I mean, I would grant him, he is not an accountant. He is not a tax professional. I think he must have read that somewhere online and thought, yeah, that's a really compelling statement to make, but it's completely erroneous. You can't work around 280E. You might learn to work with it, not work
exactly. Around. That's a perfect quote. What do you think about just misinformation as it comes to taxes and law in cannabis?
Oh, it's huge. It is huge because, you know, the gray market thinks, yeah, there's no way I could make a living because of the taxes. Well, that's not correct. You would not make as much profit, but maybe, you know, like I told my smoke shop owner that called me and said, I'm paying too much in payroll tax. I said, well, maybe we need to talk about you raising prices.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think there's misinformation on that side. And then it's very common to go to conventions and hear people say, yeah, I need to find a way to work around 280E. And again, I get back to, don't work around it. Don't hide from it. Don't do anything. Simply work with it. Yeah. Build it into your business model.
Yeah. And exactly. And understand, I think, just how to manage cash flow, like understand kind of the hurdles that you have and what you can play around with. But at the very beginning, when I was really doing consulting, I found it so hard because I always wanted to save people and, you know, like, oh, the people with shiny eyes, like, I'm going to start this cannabis business. I'm like, yes, but unfortunately you have to pay all of these taxes. And I would just see their smile go away. But you have to just understand what you have to pay. To me, the only way to get quote unquote around 280E is to manage your business with a budget and use allocations. I'm not sure if you do that with any of your clients, but just like thinking about it, like, okay, like once you're aware of your sales pricing and your costing, then okay, you're allocating 20% of that gross profit directly to taxes. What else do you have to play around with so you can be more flexible with actually managing your business?
But here's an idea, and it's really only an idea without much data to support it. But you're currently living and working and based in Europe. I find that of my clients who come from Europe, my tax clients outside of the cannabis space, but my regular Form 1040 tax clients, those who have either lived in Europe or originated from Europe at some point. If I tell them their tax bill, they're very accepting of it. Sure.
Yes.
$40,000. I understand. Where do I send the money? My American clients, there's tremendous pushback. If I tell them, gee, at the end of the tax year, your withholdings were not sufficient, so you owe $1,800. What do you mean $1,800? Let me send you more receipts. I'm sure I have more write-offs.
Yes.
Well, they're called deductions, and actually, it's not a dollar for dollar. It's not like you gave $40 worth of used clothing to Housing Works and you're going to get $40 back. First of all, you didn't even, you're still with the standard deduction. You don't even get to itemize. So there's this perception in American thinking that tax is bad, and tax is the government encroaching upon my life and my business. And I think that is the fundamental piece that would need to shift for us to really accept, 280E is simply a part of doing cannabis. It's simply a part of a cannabis business cycle. Just like in alcohol, if you let's look at a pack of cigarettes. How much of that consumer price on a pack of cigarettes is tax? And it's something ridiculous, like 90%, because a few tobacco leaves in a little paper, that really doesn't cost a lot to manufacture, right?
No, it's such a good point. It's such a good point. Well, and it makes me curious because I've been doing a lot now more focus on like personal finance and wealth building as part of where I want to go and where I want to focus my like educational stuff. And then when you think about that, there's so much resistance. Like money management isn't hard, but it's like the emotions that are related to money management. And then it made me wonder like, I wonder what parallels, like we've always been told, like, it's like there's two things that you can't avoid, like death and taxes. But then like where in the American psyche do you think this all came from? And like what emotional stories have we probably been learning and telling ourselves about like, I have to pay those taxes. Like, it's taking from me. And so it's very interesting to actually dive a little bit deeper into why that perception even exists.
Well, remember when America was first established after the Revolutionary War, we did not have a tax base. We did not have taxation at all. And that was really critical to the founders because they didn't want to, they had just released themselves from the obligation to give tax money to the king. So they didn't want George Washington to be king. They did not want to pay taxes from the various former colonies, newly founded states. They didn't want to pay it into a central point of taxation. In my thinking, that is still so much a part of American thought.
You're right. Because I mean, there's so many interesting books. I'm more interested in like the psychological stuff, right? And that makes sense. Like that is how we were born as a country, and the thoughts and the experiences, and that's generational stuff. So it makes sense. Well, that reminds me, I saw some headline about there's some bill by the Republicans trying to get rid of federal taxes. Like, is that just like some fluff, or like, is there a support behind that? Cause it's just wild to me knowing that.
I think for much of my life, there's been discussion of let's dispense with the IRS and have a flat tax, which there are other countries that have done that. But the reality is we would still have this wealth gap, right? Because the portion of income that would go to taxation for somebody who's making $50,000 a year would be vastly different than the portion of income going to taxation for somebody who's making $1 million a year. So how is that fair? But then when, Republican lawmakers are batting about these tax measures, it's really for the headline. It's really not.
Okay.
Does every American want to abolish the IRS? Why, of course they do. But then they want
the repercussions.
But then, if there's a federal disaster like a hurricane or a snowstorm that's devastating, what do they want? They want FEMA.
Yeah. Or I think even public education, or, now I have lived in Europe for a little bit. Like, I mean, free healthcare. I know that America doesn't have that fully, but like there are these just very interesting things. But what was fascinating is, so I'm, working a little bit more in personal finance. So really diving in even to the different tax brackets. And then I looked at the percentage of each of the income tax brackets. And it's just interesting how they even decided to choose at what point you jump from a 12 to a 22. But I'm like, it just doesn't make sense. And so it's just,
also
it's
the
interesting
way that those numbers can be manipulated, right? From your gross income all the way down to what you're really taxed on can be quite different, especially if you're a self-employed individual.
Exactly. Thanks so much for listening to this week's show. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you enjoyed this, leave us a 5-star review. Make sure that you share this episode on your social media and tag us in the Instagram stories. You can find us wherever you go on social media. Just look up Cannabis Business Minds. Have an idea for the show or something that you want to talk about? Shoot us an email at podcast@cannabisbusinessminds.com.